Chapter 6, Section 1, Voting Rights, African Americans. When the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1788, it contained no stipulations concerning suffrage, the right to vote. Instead, the Constitution left voting rights up to the individual states. Prior to the 1820s, most states permitted only a limited number of white men to vote. Some states employed a variety of restrictions, including property ownership and religious affiliation requirements. States gradually abandoned many of their voting restrictions, and by the 1860s, white men had achieved near universal suffrage in the United States. While voting rights were expanding for white men, however, states actively barred women, African Americans, Native Americans, and many immigrants from voting. African Americans. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, which ended in 1865, a movement was launched to obtain voting rights for African American men. After the United States officially ended slavery with the 13th Amendment, it adopted the 14th Amendment to define African Americans as full U.S. citizens. The 14th Amendment, however, did not directly guarantee African American men the right to vote. This prompted Congress to propose the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1870. This amendment states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." African American men were finally legally guaranteed the right to vote. This newly gained right to vote continued to be suppressed, however, through intimidation tactics and a variety of restrictive measures such as poll taxes and literacy tests. Many African Americans could not afford to pay the poll taxes, especially given the poor economic conditions in the South. Poor whites who could not afford to pay the poll taxes were assisted by white supremacy groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, which would pay the poll taxes for whites in order to continue the system that disenfranchised black voters. The literacy tests often required perfect scores and were frequently designed to be confusing. Again, white voters received preferential treatment. They were able to bypass this requirement through a grandfather clause, unavailable to black voters. Those who had been allowed to vote in the state prior to the Civil War and their descendants did not have to complete literacy tests. Laws like these that discriminated against African Americans from Reconstruction to the mid-1960s are known collectively as Jim Crow laws. Therefore, despite the constitutional protections provided by the Civil War amendments, African Americans in the South were largely disenfranchised until 1965. For example, in 1960, less than 10% of blacks in Mississippi were registered to vote. The Civil Rights Movement renewed efforts to enforce voting rights for African Americans. In 1964, the 24th Amendment was adopted to prohibit poll taxes in federal elections, removing a significant barrier for registered voters. To further remedy issues with voting rights restrictions, Congress passed civil rights bills in 1957, 1960, and 1964, all of which contained voting-related provisions. However, it was not until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that significant voting protections were extended to all black people. The Voting Rights Act outlawed literacy tests and other tactics that limited voter registration, the process of officially signing up to vote, and the actual process of voting. Under this act, federal officials were sent to the South to ensure that African Americans were allowed to vote free from fear and intimidation. Additionally, this act required local governments to submit changes in their voting and electoral practices to the U.S. Department of Justice in order to ensure they were not discriminatory.